The Acer Nitro 5 is a budget-friendly gaming laptop, but just how well does it perform? In this detailed review, I'll show you everything it's got to offer and help you decide if it's a laptop you should consider buying. I've got the AMD configuration of the Nitro 5 here, rather than the Intel and Nvidia model. So other than performance, thermals, and battery life, the information here should mostly apply to both models. Starting with the specs, this unit has an AMD Ryzen 5 2500U quad-core CPU with Vega 8 graphics. So it's got a 2GHz base clock and a 3.6GHz max boost. I've got 16GB of memory running at DDR4 2666 and single channel, but it's got 2 slots available, so performance could be improved with a dual channel configuration. For the storage, the single M.2 slot is populated with a 128GB SATA SSD, while the single 2.5-inch drive bay has a 1TB hard drive installed. For the graphics, there's a Radeon RX 560X with 4GB of memory, and we'll see how well this performs later in the benchmarks. This powers the 15.6-inch 1080p 60Hz IPS panel. For network connectivity, there's a gigabit Ethernet port, support for 802.11 AC Wi-Fi, and Bluetooth. The Nitro 5 features a grooved black plastic carbon fiber pattern on the top, and a similar smooth pattern on the interior. The build quality wasn't bad, considering the whole thing's plastic. No sharp corners or anything like that. The dimensions of the laptop are 39cm in width, 26.8cm in depth, and 2.66cm in height, so about average for a 15-inch laptop in this sort of price range. The weight is listed as 2.7 kilos, although mine was a fair bit lighter at around 2.4 kilos. With the 135-watt power brick and cables for charging included, it increased to around 3 kilos. As mentioned, it's got a 15.6-inch 1080p 60Hz IPS panel, though no mention of whether or not it supports FreeSync anywhere. But the Radeon settings list FreeSync as disabled, and I did notice tearing in games. As an IPS panel, viewing angles were alright in terms of color shift, but it did appear a little darker on an angle. I've measured the current color gamut using the Spider 5 Pro, and my results returned 64% of sRGB, 46% of NTSC, and 48% of Adobe RGB, so not great, but okay for gaming. At 100% brightness, I measured the panel at 276 nits in the center, and with a 920:1 contrast ratio. So alright brightness, but nothing special, and decent contrast. I've taken a long exposure photo in a dark room as a worst case backlight bleed test, and there were no serious problems with my unit. A few imperfections picked up on camera, but I could hardly see these with my own eyes during the test, and never noticeable during normal use. However, this will vary between laptops. There's some flex to the screen while pushing it, although it felt fairly sturdy as it's thick plastic. The hinges are out towards the far left and right corners, which also aids in stability. The laptop could just be opened up with one finger. There seems to be a little more weight towards the back, though no problems using it on my lap. Above the display in the center is a 720p camera.
The camera doesn't look too bad, and the microphone sounds alright too, but you'll be able to judge both for yourself.
The keyboard was pretty good to type with. I had no issues with it to call out. It's got red backlighting, which can only be turned on or off using the function and F9 keys. There are no effects, other colors, or levels of dimness. It's either red lighting on or off, and that's it. Here's what typing sounds like to try and give you an idea of what to expect. There was some keyboard flex while pushing down hard, but I never found this to be a problem during normal use. The touchpad was smooth to the touch and worked fine. It can be clicked down anywhere to left click, or down the bottom left and right sides for left and right click, or 2-finger clicked anywhere to right click. On the left, there's a Kensington lock, gigabit Ethernet port, USB 3.1 Gen 1 Type-C port, no Thunderbolt support here unfortunately, HDMI output, USB 3.0 Type-A port, and SD card slot. On the right, there's a 3.5mm audio combo jack, 2 USB 2.0 Type-A ports, status LEDs, and the power input. On the back, there's just an air exhaust vent towards one side, along with some subtle Nitro branding on the top red plastic, while the front is just smooth plastic. On the back of the carbon fiber lid, there's the Acer logo in the center with a mirrored finish. Fingerprints don't show up too well on the lid as it's a textured surface. However, they show up quite easily on the inside, though as a smoother surface, they're easy to wipe away. Underneath, there are some rubber feet, which did a good job of preventing the laptop from sliding around while in use, as well as some air intake vents towards the back. The speakers are found towards the front bottom corners on the left and right sides, and they sound decent for laptop speakers, still clear at high volumes with a tiny bit of bass. There are two panels which each have one screw to open, giving you easy access to the 2.5-inch drive bay and memory slots for easy upgradability. The rest of the base comes off by taking out the remaining 14 screws with a Phillips head screwdriver, and this gives us further access to the Wi-Fi card, battery, and single M.2 slot. Powering the laptop is a 4-cell 48 Wh battery, and with a full charge and just watching YouTube videos with the screen on half brightness, lighting effects off, and background apps disabled, I was able to use it for 3 hours and 17 minutes. When not doing graphically intensive tasks, the laptop will use the less powerful Vega 8 graphics in the CPU, rather than the more powerful Radeon RX 560X. While playing The Witcher 3 with medium settings, it lasts for around an hour and 20 minutes. Although the frame rate on battery power was a bit low compared to running on wall power, but either way the battery life wasn't too bad. Thermal testing was completed with an ambient room temperature of 20 degrees Celsius, so expect warmer temperatures in a warmer environment. Also keep in mind there's a shared heat pipe between the processor and graphics, so a change in one component may affect the other. Starting at the bottom of the graph in light blue, I've got the idle temperatures, and the CPU was a little warm compared to the GPU. While gaming with the fans on default speeds, shown by the green bar, the temperatures go up but they're still pretty good, and can be improved by 9 degrees Celsius by maxing out the fans, shown by the yellow bar. The stress tests were done by running Acer 64 and the Heaven benchmark at the same time, in order to attempt to fully utilize both the processor and graphics. Continuing up in the graph with the red bar, we're reaching the highest temperatures in this worst case scenario. Though again, realistically, these aren't very hot at all compared to many other laptops I've tested, likely as the hardware isn't as powerful. With the fans maxed out in the purple bar, we're able to lower the temperatures by around 10 degrees Celsius. These are the clock speeds I got while running the tests just shown. Absolutely no change at all to the GPU, which was static. We can see small improvements to the CPU with better cooling applied. However, as shown by the temperatures before, it wasn't near throttling. With the CPU-only stress test running and no GPU load, the clock speeds were able to get a little higher. To demonstrate how this translates into performance, I've got some Cinebench CPU benchmarks here. Just for comparison, I've also got some other Intel 4-core 8-thread CPUs for reference. I haven't tested the 7300 HQ myself, so don't have the data, but it seems to be below the 2500U in this test. I'll also note that no undervolting has been tested here, as I wasn't able to work out how to do this with a Ryzen mobile CPU. After some research, it seems like there are no software applications available at this time to support this, but if I'm wrong, let me know. As for the external temperatures where you'll actually be putting your hands, at idle it was in the low 30 degrees Celsius range, fairly average. While gaming, it gets to the mid-40s in the center and high 40s up the back, and a very similar result was noted with the CPU and GPU stress tests running. Quite cool overall. As for the fan noise produced by the laptop, I'll let you have a listen to some of these tests. At idle, the fans were still fairly audible, and while gaming and under stress test, we're getting the same noise levels. And I'll note that this is 5 to 10 decibels quieter than most other gaming laptops I've tested. Though again, they do typically have more powerful hardware and require more cooling. Once we max the fan out, we're around average with most other laptops. Finally, let's take a look at some gaming benchmarks. All games will run at 1080p with the latest Windows updates and these AMD drivers. Fortnite was tested with the replay feature, and at epic and high settings, the performance wasn't great. I would definitely suggest playing at medium settings or lower, as this is able to get us around the 60 FPS mark, but more importantly, there was less stuttering, as illustrated by the 1% lows. Overwatch was tested playing in the practice range. It still felt playable for the most part at epic settings, but the overall experience was better at ultra settings or lower. I didn't notice any issues with ultra settings, which was able to average above 60 FPS while still looking great. PUBG was tested using the replay feature, and is an example of what we start to see with more resource-intensive or less optimized games. It was playable for the most part at very low settings. I wouldn't want to go any higher than that personally. CSGO was tested using the Euletical benchmark, and the results were a bit lower than I expected. Still high enough for a first-person shooter game and definitely playable, but I'd probably look for something with higher specs if you want to go pro. Rainbow Six Siege was tested with the built-in benchmark, and I've found this test to generally run very well on all laptops. So even on this hardware, we're still seeing fairly good results. No real difference between ultra and very high settings, and over 100 FPS average with the low preset. Dota 2 was tested using a fairly intensive replay, so this should be a worst case scenario. These results are not the same as actually playing the game. In this test, the frame rates aren't excellent. But even with these numbers, I think you can still play the game without issue. Battlefield 1 was played during the first campaign mission, and I was playing with no problems at all on medium or low settings. Even high or ultra were fine most of the time. But I think for this type of game, you'd probably want to try and stick to a 60 FPS average or above. Watch Dogs 2 is a demanding game, and I always say that this doesn't need a high frame rate to play, which was the case here. I found high settings or below to run perfectly fine, so it seems as long as you're getting 30 FPS it should run alright. Doom was tested using Vulkan, and at all setting levels it played fairly smoothly, though there was some choppiness at times, which seems to be illustrated by the 1% low results being under 30 FPS. Though this was nowhere near as low at low settings, which did play noticeably better. The Witcher 3 played alright at medium or low settings, but it was noticeably slower at higher ultra settings. So still playable, but you'll just need to stick to the lower setting levels. I haven't been able to test some of my usual games like Ghost Recon as it wouldn't load. Shadow of the Tomb Raider was crashing on start, and Far Cry 5 and Assassin's Creed Odyssey didn't recognize the RX 560X and instead were using the Vega 8 graphics, so barely reaching 10 FPS on minimum settings. You could probably put in some workarounds to fix these, but I still think it's worth noting these are more issues than I've ever had testing the same games on an Intel and Nvidia combination. I did try manually changing the games using Vega graphics to the 560X, but it made no difference. To be honest, the results are a fair bit lower than most other laptops I've tested, but the price point of it is also a fair bit lower than most others too. In the games tested, it's still definitely able to offer a playable experience. You'll just need to stick to medium or low settings for the most part, especially if you're planning on playing AAA games. I've used Crystal Diskmark to test out the storage. The M.2 SATA SSD is going well for the reads, but not so great for the writes. The 1TB 5400 RPM hard drive is scoring about where I'd expect it to, while the SD card was tested with a V90 rated card and was doing pretty good, considering something like the Dell G7 only gets 20 MB per second. For updated pricing, check the links in the description, as prices will change over time. At the time of recording, here in Australia, with these exact specs, it can be picked up for under $1,300 Australian dollars on sale. In the US, it's around $780 US, though with half the memory but bigger SSD. This is the first AMD laptop I've tested, but it does seem like you might be better off getting the Intel and Nvidia configuration instead. I haven't tested it, but for around the same price, you get the i5-8300H, which as shown earlier in Cinebench seems to beat the 2500U by a fair bit. And it's got a 1050 Ti too, which also seems to beat the RX 560X. So what do you guys think about the Acer Nitro 5 gaming laptop? A lot of you have been asking me to review this one for a while now, and it took me a while to get it, but here we finally are. For the money, I think it's a decent gaming laptop. You're able to play most games at around medium settings no problem. The build quality was decent, and overall it just worked well. I did have some problems launching some games, which seems to be due to the Radeon graphics. So that could probably be fixed with further investigation or software updates. The screen quality wasn't great and was another weak area, but not surprising as it seems to be where many gaming laptops try to cut costs. It'll look fine in games, just not great color gamut or brightness. To be honest, I'd probably look at the Intel and Nvidia combination myself, as based on the specs, I suspect it may perform a bit better for around the same price. Let me know what you guys thought down in the comments, and leave a like to let me know if you found the review useful. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for future tech videos like this one.